Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. It's a good movie. Okay, for real though, I was blown away by this movie. Following the first Spider-Verse movie, I think a lot of us went into this one expecting it to be amazing, and then left feeling like they had just witnessed the greatest film of all time. It's that good. It's probably the best superhero movie I've ever seen, and that actually extends to the soundtrack as well. I'm serious, I think Metro Boomin's Spider-Verse 2 soundtrack might be my favorite movie soundtrack of all time. Okay, except for this one, or that. And let me make my point. Metro's soundtrack is so well integrated into the movie itself, accentuating the dramatic and emotional scenes while feeling like it could also exist in-universe alongside Miles and the rest of the Spider-Men. The music isn't just impressive in the realm of movie soundtracks, though. Metro assembled a dream team of artists, from Lil Wayne to 21 Savage to James Blake, hell, even Nas shows up here, and they're all backed by these rainy, moody instrumentals that put me right into the world of the film. It's cinematic and dark while still remaining uplifting and even triumphant at points. Now that I think about it, it really shouldn't have been all that surprising that this album turned out as good as it did. Back in 2018, the soundtrack to the original Spider-Verse movie garnered some serious attention due to the blowout success of Post Malone and Sway Lee's Sunflower, which, if you're not aware, literally broke the record for the most platinum certifications of any song ever. By that one metric, this is the most popular song of all time, and that really speaks to the power of movie soundtracks in general. A good movie soundtrack succeeds by not only successfully scoring the film it's derived from, but also standing on its own as a significant work of art removed from that context. Sometimes they can be deeply conceptual, super tied to the atmosphere of the movie they are accompanying, but other times they can just be fun collections of tracks with a bunch of artists coming together to make songs loosely inspired by the movie in question. Loosely being the operative word there. I think any album that has a connection to something greater than itself is super interesting, and it's neat to see artists contribute songs to these albums outside of the context of their own solo careers. You get to see a different side of them, for better or worse, when they're playing the game of Hollywood, knowing they'll be exposed to a way wider audience than they would be otherwise. So today, I just want to chill out and take a dive into the world of movie soundtracks, dip my toes a bit into a bunch of movies I haven't really seen, and probably piss off a few people as I throw out some rapid-fire opinions on their favorite rappers. A couple ground rules though. I specifically want to talk about soundtracks that are mostly comprised of original material that hadn't appeared elsewhere, meaning that, unfortunately, I will not be discussing Suicide Squad here today. Secondly, I'm narrowing the focus down to those that are primarily hip-hop, since that's what this channel has always been about. I honestly just don't feel qualified to sit down and discuss Purple Rain or Saturday Night Fever. The Barbie soundtrack though, that one's pretty good. Finally, I'm in no way claiming this is a complete list of albums that fit my criteria. If you're mad that I left out your favorite soundtrack album, then comment below, I might revisit it in a future part. For now though, let's just talk about Black Panther. I think for a lot of people, this is the movie soundtrack of all time. The Black Panther movie was massive, and in 2018, there was nobody bigger in the hip-hop mainstream than Kendrick Lamar, who was fresh off the release of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Damn. At this point, Kendrick had more than cemented his reputation as one of the most socially conscious artists of the 2010s, and is just a leading voice of his generation, so it was only natural for Ryan Coogler, the director of Black Panther, to approach Kendrick about writing a couple songs for the film. Long story short, this thing kicks ass, and it makes the entire Black Panther experience 10 times better. The choice to mix hip-hop with traditional African instrumentation and artists makes this album stand out so much from other releases at the time, and conceptually, it's kind of a perfect match for the world of Wakanda. Kendrick isn't known for half-assing anything, and this project feels just as substantial narratively and sonically as any of his other solo releases. There are songs on here like King's Dead, Bloody Waters, and Ops that stand toe-to-toe with any of Kendrick's solo material. And the project is deeply cinematic in the way it presents its core themes of excellence and triumphance. I think All of the Stars is probably the most famous song off this project, which is a bit of a bummer. It's not my favorite here. When any song from one of these movie soundtrack albums ends up getting big, it's typically the pop-friendly radio cut, so while All of the Stars isn't necessarily bad, it doesn't feel as sonically relevant to Black Panther as a lot of the other songs here. Personally, I would choose Redemption to best illustrate the poppier side of Black Panther, as it features more of the African influence that truly defines the sound of this album. There isn't much about this one I can say that hasn't been said before. It's a perfectly executed companion to Black Panther, but it's also just another fantastic entry in Kendrick Lamar's discography. If you haven't heard this, you have to listen to it. Allow yourself to get immersed into the world of the music and you won't regret it. This thing is 100% deserving of all of the praise it's received. Continuing on with our discussion of masterpieces, 2018 brought us another one at the very end of the year with everyone's favorite Smash Brothers leak, The Grinch. I was gonna make a joke about Benedict Cumberbatch's smash hit being the only movie that anybody cared about in November of 2018, but upon doing further research, I found out that this is actually the highest grossing Christmas movie of all time. That is actually an insane statistic. You're telling me this movie made more money than America's Sweetheart and Macaulay Culkin, and the original Grinch movie? If I had to guess why this movie was so successful, it's probably because America's Other Sweetheart was the one providing the soundtrack. In 2018, Tyler the Creator was one of the most polarizing figures in all of pop culture, which in hindsight kind of makes him the perfect choice for this movie about a little goblin of an anti-hero, though at the time, I just remember being so bewildered by this pick. Like, if he did this now, it wouldn't be nearly as crazy as the fact that he did it in 2018, 3 years after the release of Cherry Bomb, which came out the same year he literally got banned from the UK for inciting terrorism. Tyler wasn't exactly your family-friendly guy at this point. He was a fucking freak, and I'm not arguing whether or not this was justified. It really wasn't, but I'm just setting the scene for you. A terrorist has been commissioned by the Minions to write for Dr. Seuss. Context aside, the music's actually really nice. I'm unfortunately a sucker for Christmas music of any kind, and the melodies on this thing are all perfectly cheesy, twinkly, and nostalgic. Tyler delivers a super solid verse on Big Bag, and the guest appearances from Ryan Beatty, who you might know through his work with Brockhampton, are just as angelic as you would expect. Overall, this is a nice little EP to throw on during the Christmas season, though when YouTube Music transitions directly into Tyler's older material, it truly puts into perspective how insane this collab was. Moving away from the 2010s for a second, I want to talk about an album that I had never heard of at all before starting work on this video, and has since become one of my favorite guilty pleasures in all of music. You probably don't remember the 1993 film Judgement Night, starring Emilia Estevez, but god if its accompanying soundtrack isn't the complete opposite of forgettable. Rap rock was a genre that was experiencing some decent success on the radio in the early 90s, primarily as a way to bring hip-hop music to an audience that otherwise would have missed out on the genre entirely. I guess in an effort to capitalize on that success, Judgement Night's soundtrack takes 10 hip-hop acts and 11 of the most popular rock groups of the era, and mashes them together in the studio to create perhaps the most distinctly 90s piece of media I have ever consumed. In terms of names, this track list is ridiculously stacked. Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr., Slayer, and Pearl Jam show up as some of the biggest names on the rock side, while groups like De La Soul, Run DMC, and Cypress Hill fill out the hip-hop roster, all coming together to produce a collection of 11 diamonds in the rough, gems ranging from surprisingly quality to laughably ridiculous. I don't care. I enjoyed every second of this album, a lot of it ironically, and some of it actually kind of earnestly. Fallen by Teenage Fan Club and De La Soul is 100% my favorite here. Built around a warm Tom Petty sample, this one is laid back and smoky, bringing out the best of both of these artists. Missing Link is a great amalgamation of Dinosaur Jr.'s stoner riffs and Del the Funky Homo Sapiens off-kilter songwriting, and Me, Myself, and My Microphone is about as natural of a pairing as you'll ever see on a project like this. Meanwhile, a song like Real Thing by Pearl Jam and Cypress Hill, it feels like it should only exist as the drive-out song to a truck in Monster Jam. Is this album actually good? Like, I don't know. I don't even really care. I just think everyone should listen to this because it is fucking ridiculous. Staying in the 90s for a second, there were a lot of movie soundtrack albums, mainly due to the prevalence of rappers that were attempting to transition into acting careers, which saw mixed success. I alluded to it earlier, but the Nas and DMX vehicle Belly features one of the most wooden performances I have ever seen on film. Nas, listen, I love you, man, but you're not De Niro. Honestly, I'm just confused why they let Nas be the lead role in a movie to begin with. I've seen a lot of interviews of the guy, and he seems pretty stoic and not very emotive in general, so why anyone thought he would be excelling as a multi-dimensional lead actor is completely beyond me. The soundtrack, on the other hand, is a completely different story, which seems to be a trend with a lot of these. Really great soundtracks to pretty mediocre movies. This one is especially good though. Grand Finale, featuring stars DMX and Nas alongside Method Man and Ja Rule on the chorus, is incredibly solid for a project like this. It's songs like these that make me grateful that these soundtrack albums exist, as Grand Finale wouldn't really fit on any of these three artists' trajectory in 1998, but finds its place on Belly and cements itself as a bona fide classic regardless. There's a lot of East Coast love on this one. Crew Love has a young Jay-Z and other members of the future Rockefellers. Windpipe is a RZA-produced Woo cut. Tommy's Theme is a posse cut by both the Lox and Made Men. Overall, this one's definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of the old school boom bap sound. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, both Snoop Dogg and especially Tupac were basically mainstream celebrities at this point. Based on that fact, I'm inclined to say that their soundtrack albums are a little more well-known. Maybe? I hadn't heard of them before this, but Above the Rim especially seems to be pretty highly regarded. I have to admit a bit of East Coast bias on my part, but I did enjoy this listen. There is a lot of R&B here that didn't age as well to me as a lot of the hip-hop tracks, but the vibe of the project as a whole was bouncy and fun. It is a little weird though that Tupac isn't on this album more. I guess he was probably busy like making the movie, but his one song here is so good that it makes his absence pretty noticeable. Regardless though, Above the Rim is not composed of entirely original material, so let's talk about one that is. Okay, I lied, this one's also not entirely original, but I have to talk about it anyway. Murder Was the Case is a 1994 short film and soundtrack album starring and performed by Snoop Dogg, directed by Dr. Dre and Fab Five Freddy, chronicling the fictional death of Snoop Dogg and his resurrection after making a deal with the devil. I've got nothing to add to that, that's just how it is. Is this ridiculous? Yes. Can you find the entire short film on YouTube? Yes. Is this another semi-bloated West Coast rap album that has a bunch of mediocre R&B cuts that overshadow some genuinely good hip-hop tracks? Yes. Moving on. Would it be wrong to say that 8 Mile is the most famous soundtrack album of all time? Like, everyone knows Lose Yourself. They quote this shit in youth groups across the Midwest, and it's easily the biggest song to ever come out of a project like this, but does that fame extend to the rest of the album? What I will definitively say is that this is one of the tightest album experiences that we've come across so far. Eminem curated this track list himself, bringing together some legends that personally inspired him to start rapping, as well as some of his industry friends that were either currently huge or about to blow up in the eyes of the public. But these artists all meshed together to create a tribute to the art of rapping itself, and the end result is pretty solid altogether. Eminem deserves a lot of credit for this album, and if he's not rapping on a song, then odds are he's working on the boards behind the scenes. That is also my biggest gripe with this album though. It's all preference, but I hate an Eminem beat. They're almost always clunky and boring, with these basic piano chords that are occasionally interrupted by a strained string sample. They can be painfully basic, and it doesn't help his case that nearly all of them sound identical to each other. With that being said, his production is not at its most egregious on this project. Lose Yourself and especially 8 Mile Road are both great instrumentals, and I'd argue that Eminem's production is a major factor in why this album feels so cohesive. The movie and album are supposed to be representative of his life, so I don't mind if musically a few of these beats are a little monotonous. Now, 8 Miles and Runnin' by Jay-Z and Freeway is pure ugly Eminem beat at its finest, and that is an always skip. I don't want to come off too negative here though, because I really do enjoy the 8 Mile soundtrack. It's clearly a very personal project to Eminem, and a further testament to his overall artistry with both this album and his acting in the movie. Despite the extent of his involvement though, Eminem only features on around a third of this album's 16 tracks. To this point, we haven't come across a movie soundtrack album where the credited artists are integral to both the movie and the music. Kendrick was all over the Black Panther album, but didn't feature in the movie. Tupac starred in Above the Rim, but was barely featured at all on the accompanying album. Well, as per usual, you can leave it to Outkast to go consistently above and beyond even your wildest expectations. In 2006, not only did Andre 3000 and Big Boy star in a 2-hour-long feature film, but they also created an accompanying soundtrack album for their final swan song as a duo, Idlewild. If you know anything about Outkast, you probably know that Idlewild is widely considered the black sheep of the duo's discography. To be fair to Idlewild, it's coming off of the heels of Aquemini, Stankonia, and Speakerboxxx and The Love Below, one of the greatest 3-album runs of any hip-hop act ever. Now, to be unfair to Idlewild, it's pretty damn obvious why. This album is weird. It incorporates ragtime, 1930s gospel and R&B, electronics, hip-hop. There's so much going on this album, and it can be really hard to keep track of. I adore the aesthetic of Idlewild, both the album and the movie, but musically, the album sounds like it's struggling to keep up with its ambitious concept. When the album hits, it could be up there with some of Outkast's best, but in the frequent moments when it drags, it somehow manages to be boring despite its eclectic mix of genres. It kinda sucks, because I've returned to Idlewild many times with the hopes of enjoying it more, and every single time I feel like I end up turning it off halfway through. It's good, but the concept alone can't sustain the fact that Big Boi and Andre 3000 sound bored and maybe even more disconnected than they did on Speakerboxxx and The Love Below. That was a double album where they each did their own half, and this one isn't, but they seem to be separated almost as much as they were on that project. Also, Idlewild the movie features more songs from Speakerboxxx and The Love Below than it does the album it shares a name with, making this an even more confusing release. I want to shout out Call to Law featuring Janelle Monáe as a genuinely great Outkast song buried in the midst of this album, as well as the first 4 songs, which are a promising introduction to a project that unfortunately fails to sustain that momentum throughout. It's worth skimming through the tracklist of Idlewild for the nuggets of gold that are buried within, but don't go into it expecting the consistency that you'll find on other Outkast albums. As they've always said though, where Outkast fails, Kid Cudi steps up to do better. Except Chonky Fire, that's much better than Down and Out. And also, Andre kind of washed Cudi on his own song. Actually, now that I think about it, Outkast has never been outdone by Kid Cudi, and that's exactly the case with Intergalactic. I will now give you a 10-second synopsis of my feelings towards Kid Cudi's entire discography leading up towards Intergalactic. So as you can see, my feelings going into Intergalactic were pretty conflicted. For what it's worth, the movie really impressed me. Cudi isn't a bad actor at all, and he really sells his role as Jabari, even though the story being told here isn't exactly breaking new ground. Also, it should be obvious, but the way this movie is animated is simply breathtaking. It utilizes a ton of purples, reds, and pinks to conjure up this dreamlike atmosphere I can't get enough of. I know a lot of people who love this movie without caring about Kid Cudi as an artist at all, and that's super impressive. The album's impressive too, if you define impressive as
mediocre.
Intergalactic is odd because I think these songs are well incorporated into the movie itself, but on their own, there is just nothing to dissect here. The songs are passable, but they're about as innovative as a Walmart deli sandwich. This project was supposedly in development hell for multiple years, exacerbated by the pandemic, but it doesn't make any sense to me how something that Cudi worked so hard on could just sound so dull and lifeless. Don't listen to Intergalactic. I have actually nothing to say about any of these songs. It's the most milquetoast Cudi you can find, and I wouldn't even call it playlist filler. If you're gonna experience this project at all, just watch the movie. You're not missing anything of note by skipping this album. Idlewild and Intergalactic both show the inherent hubris that comes into taking on a project of this scale. What Outkast and Cudi were trying to accomplish on these projects is genuinely auteur level shit. It makes it really difficult for me to call any of these an outright failure, because they made a fucking movie and an album, and they make sense together. Who am I to say that just because these albums aren't composed of their best material that they aren't noteworthy? Of course they're noteworthy. They're at least more noteworthy than this album. As I said at the beginning, these albums have an intrinsic link to something greater than themselves. And more than the movie or the music, it's that link that I find so fascinating. Intergalactic the movie and the album are made whole by the existence of each other. You can't just have one or the other, and that's the same with Idlewild. I think it's the same with 8 Mile. It's the same with Judgement Night. It's the same with Black Panther. The coolest thing these albums can do is exist, and considering the infinite amount that don't, I don't think we should take the ones we do have for granted. I don't care if it's good, I don't care if it's bad, I just like that it's there. Anyway, sorry, I know I got a little pretentious there at the end. I just think these albums are neat and a little underappreciated. I'm thankful to have had the chance to talk about them here today, and I'm especially thankful that I named this video Movie Soundtracks, so that no one expects me to